welcome. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. Yeah, we're in Boston, as you all know. We're from Minnesota, is where the law firm is based. So we like to get out, see clients and friends, and really had a lot of fun in Boston the last couple nights here. So the twins are actually in town, just by happenstance. So I know some of our teammates are going out to see the twins tonight. We got a full day, so I'm going to jump right into it. At 10 here, just when I'm done, Nate is going to come up. Nate Downey is going to cover FDA topics. Of course, the kind of overall theme today is due diligence for FDA-regulated companies. Amanda is going to get into some compliance topics, and then we will have Paul cover some privacy and cybersecurity. Let's see if I can pull up the agenda here for y'all to follow me. And then David will cover litigation. As you all know, those are our 4 practice areas for Gardner Law: regulatory law, compliance law, privacy law, and litigation. And then I will have a panel with a few esteemed attorneys, and we will cover some questions that relate to the content for the day. And I'm very excited to have Alan Carlton here from Fuji and Irina Ridley from Aaron Medical, both attorneys at those companies. Just a couple more words from me, and then I'll hand it over to Nate here. So for some housekeeping, this program is being recorded. So, for whatever reason you have to leave a little early, you want to catch something that someone else said or watch something over again, it will be available on YouTube, and we'll disseminate that. The slides are also available on the screen in the virtual handout window on the control panel. And we can also provide the slides. We're happy to do that. For remote participants, again, if you're local here in the meeting room here, just raise your hand if you have a question. We love to engage questions while we're speaking. But if you're online and you would like to ask a question, just use the question function on the control panel. And we have a couple folks here that are going to be monitoring the questions. So please ask questions. It's more fun and interesting if you do. And then lastly, this program does have 2.75 credits for CLE for the attorneys in the audience. And that is approved through Minnesota Continuing Legal Education Board. If you're not in California, then just self-report, and we're happy to assist with whatever we can do with that. We'll provide a CLE approval code with the program and follow up on email with that. So, but if you have any questions, you can write us at office@gardner.law. All right, I'm going to hand it over to Nate. Thank you. Thanks for coming today.
Good morning. Thanks, Mark. Happy to be here in Boston. Excited to talk on this topic, which, as we all know, especially in the regulatory world, there's a few things that cause a lot of stress, right? It's getting that final submission in, getting that final package to FDA. We all know the work that goes in, the hours at the end, that final push, launching a new product, the claims are being made, making sure that's all buttoned up, our first touch with the public, making sure we don't have anything that, a regulator is going to find that's going to get us in trouble. But then there's also an acquisition, due diligence, the worry, the work that goes into scanning documents and looking at assessments and making sure that whether you're selling or buying, what you get is what you think you're going to get. You're going to get a product that's actually going to be able to be marketed. And so today I want to focus on the due diligence. I'm calling it smart due diligence, really making sure that you account for the most important things and getting the most bang out of the time and the resources you have. So happy to go in. So I'm Nate Downing. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions after this. Feel free to interrupt during the presentation, but also you can see my information on this slide. Feel free to email me at any time. So some objectives, right? An overview of a regulatory strategy, the way to approach it, right? This is high level, but if you're going to start a project, start an acquisition, what should you be looking for? And I'm really going to be talking from the side of a buyer, but obviously that's applicable to the seller as well. You've got to be considering this is what the buyer is going to be focusing on. And then product classification. right? It's something that I see that comes up a lot is classification decisions that are made to have short-term gains, but they have long-term implications that aren't accounted for. You know, how can you assess that? How can you account for that in your long-term acquisition plans and ways to address that? Quality system readiness. You know, quality system is sometimes an afterthought, and it's not on purpose. It's because generating a device, generating clinical evidence, getting all of the funding you need takes a lot of time. And we sometimes forget those internal documents are going to become external at some point. And so, you know, looking at the quality system, making sure that we know what we're looking for and what it means to be actually ready to go to FDA versus having a set of documents that sit on someone's desk, right? Pre-market communications, if you're a buyer, understanding what you should be looking for in pre-market communications to assess risk. Is there some mitigation that needs to be undertaken to account for communications that were made? Also, what kind of communications can you support from a pre-market standpoint? Promotional labeling. This is a very interesting part in a due diligence process when maybe a seller is a little bit smaller, a little more aggressive, and you have a larger buyer coming in and the risk profiles don't add up. And now you've got to account for that. You've got to make changes. You've got to assess what you find. You got to make new claims matrices, all of the things that come into it from a promotional labeling standpoint. And then looking at these areas, what are some ways to burn down risk? So when you find some areas that you are concerned with, what can you do? What steps can you take? And then we'll end with some key takeaways for acquirers and key takeaways for sellers. So an overview of the regulatory strategy. What I like to think of is understanding what is most important. And that's not just a regular standpoint. First, I like to understand what are the business objectives. If the business needs to buy something that's market ready, then my review from a regulatory standpoint is a little bit more focused on, okay, is this ready to go to FDA? Is your quality system completely ready? Do you have all the evidence generated to go to FDA? Do you have clinical study that's completed? Have you met your endpoints? All of those things that allow you to get to the market. If a business is looking for something that, hey, we like their technology, but we're going to make it our own, well, now my review can be a little bit looser, right? I can understand that we can adopt their quality system into our quality system. So it gives me a little bit of leeway there. I just have to make sure that I'm understanding the time and budget it will take to get whatever they're lacking up to speed. So understanding what is most important from a business perspective and then from a regulatory perspective, right? Quality system, making sure risks are assessed properly, having a good classification, a good evidence strategy is going to make me more successful. And so there's two coins to that, right? There's a regulatory importance, but there's a business importance. They need to marry to make everybody happy. And then determine what can be changed and what can't be changed. Well, what can't be changed? Well, things that have happened in the past, right? Have you had a clinical study? Have they undertaken a clinical study and maybe a primary was failed, so they've got to revamp it? Well, you don't get to ignore that that endpoint was failed, right? You have to understand, did I make device changes? Did I do other things in my population? Did I narrow my indication? And now I can move forward, but I still have to account for that fast failure, right? You cannot change that that failure occurred. So having a plan in place to account for it will be important. Understanding what can be changed. I think that's a broader category here, right? If you have the time and the resources, a lot of things can be changed. You can change system, documentation, evidence generation, claims, marketing materials. But just because they can be changed doesn't mean it's going to fit with, remember what we talked about in the first bullet, your business strategy. So making sure you call out all of those issues are going to be important. And then focusing on any FDA interaction. If the seller has had any interaction with FDA, what can you glean from that? What are they able to share? You know, FDA, it's not always binding. They, you know, we can change with different information that we go in from FDA, but you're always going to have to live with those initial FDA interactions, and you're going to have to be able to account for those going forward because they're always going to be referred to. So really focusing on what FDA has told you. Does your buyer say, no, it's a 510K exempt, though FDA has sent a letter and said, hey, we think this needs a 510K. Well, you should already be thinking you probably are going to need a 510K, or at least go to FDA and do another pre-submission to account for the difference in opinion. And then challenge assumptions. Just like the last statement I made, if they're assuming it's exempt, really look into that, because if you go forward and start selling a product that really should have had FDA submission, you know, your whole business model is going to be blown out of the water, because when you're going to start realizing profits, it's going to be pushed back. The money to get into a submission is going to add up, and the resources of time are going to add up, which is really going to hurt your business prospects. So product classification. Well, obviously the first thing to consider is, are you looking at a product you want to acquire in the pre-market space? All right, if so, great, that's fine. but have they had FDA review? Have they done a pre-submission, a 513G? Once again, is there precedent with the classification that they want to make? If there is, that's very helpful. I think you'll find a lot of times you're not going to have that. So then you've got to start doing your own assessments, right? What assessments have they done in-house? So now look at the classification that the buyer might be telling you, or the seller might have stated that it is, and see, do they match the intended use in the claims? Do they match the claims you want to make? If you want to have a device that has class 3 type claims and they're telling you it's exempt, there's a few things you should be asking yourself. First of, wow, where is there a big miss? But also, they might be taking kind of a layered approach, and you need to account for that and say, well, this first iteration is not going to unleash all the capabilities, right? A lot of devices that are software heavy, you can lock out capabilities. And so make sure that what your business plan is matches that classification. And it might be that you've got to do other submissions on the back end to realize the full potential of device. But understanding the classification, the rationale for it, and the intended claims and the intended use are really going to be helpful in understanding your business prospects from a short term and a long term. Are there predicate devices, other precedent that the seller can point to that's going to give you confidence that this is the right classification? You know, FDA a lot of times will look at a 510K exempt device and say, well, we don't think this is actually exempt because the ones that are on market do this and yours goes further, right? And so that doesn't automatically mean it doesn't fit with that regulation, but you better have an assessment that accounts for that and how to deal with that. Once again, maybe making sure you have time built in to go ask FDA if they agree with your assessment. That way you don't have wasted time, wasted resources in marketing a product that's not meant to be on market at this phase. And then global considerations, right? We don't just acquire products often for the US market. We want to go to EU, Japan, Korea. And so when you're looking at a classification standpoint, you may have a strong FDA strategy, and that's great. But if you have global implications, global aspirations, have you done an EU MDR assessment, right? There's a big difference between some of the class 2, 2A devices and a 2B or a 3 devices, your evidence strategy, your post-market requirements, all of those that tie up business resources are important when you're trying to launch a new product. So if you're in the pre-market space, really challenging whatever classification the buyer is telling you, or maybe they're not certain, and these are the steps you got to go through anyways or if you want to acquire this product to make sure that you are getting the full potential. And then in a post-market space, so they've already got, they're already on the market. Do they have FDA clearance or approval? Well, that's going to help you quite a bit because you're going to know at least FDA reviewed it, right? So that gives you a level of confidence. If they don't, if they are at 510K exempt product or they're not have gone through FDA review, then once again, you should be doing an assessment, to make sure that those claims, that the way that they're presenting their product is matching that non-FDA review pathway they chose. We'll get more into claims, but just as part of the assessment, you've got to be looking at intended use, right? The FDA definition of intended use is really broad. It takes for account anything relevant. And so if there's a bunch of claims out there that are being made, you want to know if they're consistent with your labeling, if they're consistent with that intended use, because it gives you more confidence that you have the right classification. So looking at that FDA guidance on claims consistent with the labeling and taking a step-by-step process to do that analysis is something I recommend clients do often, because it gives you a ready-made analysis on whether this claim can be made consistent with that FDA cleared or approved labeling. And change control, I think change control is really important. You've got a post-market product. You're looking at a seller who's maybe a smaller player, and their change control process isn't robust. Well, have they made changes that have adulterated the device? Should they have gone to FDA? Should they have been an RTR or a PMA supplement? Well, if that's the case, they should have, but they haven't. You may have an adulterated device on the market right now that no one's really realizing until you look at their change control and say, oh no, you did an annual report on this design change. This is a major miss. And now our product classification, which is intended to do X, it might be doing more than that. And you've got to do a lot of catch up, right? You're going to have to do a catch up submission, which is going to be a lot of money and time, the evidence generation, and you may have to withdraw the product from the market at that point. So really looking into the change control process, which is part of their quality system, but this also goes into the classification, is going to be important to understand the robustness of their product. And then, you get into the classification, you're looking at buying this product, and you get to their indications, right? I think this is something that I've seen multiple times, is what is the indication? right? You have a plan, you have a business plan that you want to take for this device, this product. And now you get to the indication. Is it a general indication, for the ablation of nerves? Okay, well, that's great. You can ablate a lot of nerves for the ablation of peripheral nerves, still pretty general. Or is it a specific indication, for the specific indication to ablate an area associated with atrial fibrillation, for example, right? There's a major difference in those two indications. You may not see those, but from a regulatory standpoint, you have to pick those up and say, hey, that first generic indication, that general indication, it doesn't give you much to promote. So if you don't have evidence consistent with that label, you're not going to be able to do much to tie down and get to that exact physician market you want. If you have a very specific indication, that's sometimes easier from a marketing standpoint, but if your business model was on a broader sector, you got to understand it's going to probably take FDA submissions to update those indications to meet your intended audience in the end. So take a very close look at the indications, do an assessment against what your preferred business model is, and make sure that there's a match. And then I've kind of alluded to this earlier, but look if they've taken a phase approach, right? So if a client, or excuse me, if a seller has initially launched as maybe a 510K exempt product, and they might be, once again, locking down those capabilities. So there might be an opportunity for a phased approach. As long as you identify that and understand that and let the business know, hey, we can get to this indication, but it may take 4 years and a $10 million clinical study. If that works, then it's everybody's happy, right? Then we've got something that you can point to, and we're all on the same page. If we buy it and say, hey, we can get there, but we haven't identified that we're missing a clinical study, business is not going to be happy when there's an extra 10 million in 3 years unaccounted for, right? So looking at the indication, understanding the full potential of it, and being realistic at where you are. And then product capability. I always think that this is part of the phase approach, but really make sure that FDA understands the product capability as well, because the marketing team is going to want to push it to its full capability. So the regulatory team, making sure that the indications and the product capability are messaged properly, are going to really help your team as a marketing be more successful in their initial launch, because they're going to know the limitations of what they can say. Quality system readiness. This is something I see a lot in smaller companies who are often looking to sell, because it's not easy, right? It's expensive, it's time consuming. It takes expertise to get the documentation right. And so making sure you have a robust way to assess quality systems is important, right? Do they have a design history file? Do you know how to build the device? Could someone else grab this file and make the same device, make it the same way? Yes, that's important. No, well, you're going to have some gaps you got to assess for. Risk documentation. This is something that regulatory bodies really pour over when they're making an assessment on a change, on a new approval. They want to know the risks that your device, your product brings to the patient, to the user group, whoever it might be. And so you need to make sure you have a robust process to account for that, right? EU MDR has a very different risk process than it did 7-8 years ago. And so looking through and having the right experts on your team to assess the risk documentation is going to get you more market ready than if you just have a couple of documents that were quickly put together. Because that's where I see a lot of people in the last hour of a submission saying, oh, shoot, we need to update our risk documentation. Well, now your risk, which should have been way before a lot of your evidence generation, is the last document. You're going to have a lot of tough conversations with the regulatory agency. Supporting evidence, right? This isn't not necessarily about the supporting evidence you generate, but how you store it, how you prove it was generated properly, test reports, test plans, clinical quality documents, all of the things that you can put to FDA and say, hey, here's how we prove our device is doing exactly what we said. You can see each patient, de-identified, what their outcomes were, our reports, our case reports, in an audit. And so making sure that your quality system is robust enough for all of that. Global considerations, obviously it's kind of a bullet point on all of this. I'm very FDA focused, but still the quality system from a global standpoint, are they part of MD SAP? That can really help you, knowing that they've been audited in a sense that accounts for multiple geographies. That gives you a different sense of your business plan and maybe the ability to go to some geographies sooner than you thought. But at least understanding that and looking for that is going to give you a heads up. And then some quality system diligence a little bit further. Good documentation practices. Are they following 21 Part 11 for electronic documents? Are they signing things? Are they making updates properly? Do they have a good quality system that has version control? They're using major versions only. The minor versions are well documented. The history is well documented, right? All of those things that take a lot of time and energy that sometimes some of those smaller sellers don't purposefully, but they might not get to. And so do I need to go and help them redo their document, make sure as best as we can, fill in any gaps, right? It's not easy, right? Because good documentation practices says we got to do it at the time this occurred, but finding issues before an audit finds them and at least being able to account for them will make it a lot easier in your company than realizing them on the back end. Corrective and preventive action. The non-conformances that can add up time by time at smaller companies looking to sell, sometimes they're small, right? If you have one product, but they still are going to add up. You're going to have non-conformances. So what I always like to do is make sure that they're documenting a non-conformance and they are saying, hey, this isn't a big issue, why? And the first thing we always focus on in any issue that comes in our industry is patient harm, right? So a lot of these pre-market, they're not going to have any patient harm at the time because they should be addressing it. But if you're out in the market, if you're looking for a post-market company, you do need to make sure there's no patient harm in mitigating that. But those non-conformances, they can add up. And so if they've opened up a CAPA, right, you want to look into those CAPAs. Are they aging? Have they been out there for 1-2 years? And so when you take this on, you're going to have a CAPA that maybe has been failing effectiveness, right? And so not only are you buying this company, but you're taking on a $2 to $3 million project just to get the quality system, just to account for this non-conformance. Is it design? Is it marketing? There's a million places you can have a CAPA. And then are they even assessing for CAPAs? I think a lot of companies, sometimes when I'm advising them, I'll say, hey, consider whether a CAPA is needed. Oh, it's not needed. Well, how do you know? Have you looked through the steps of a CAPA? Do you have a good root cause analysis that even allows you to prove effectiveness, right? So all of these steps as part of a CAPA that big robust companies just have built into their process. Some of these smaller sellers, they don't have the capabilities. So looking into it in your due diligence and really highlighting whether any CAPAs exist, or if there should be a CAPA, and understanding how they've treated non-conformances is going to be an important step to making sure that their quality system's up to date. And then audit ready. This is a generic one, obviously, but making sure that things are audit ready, right? Looking at the documentation, looking at the experts, who can account for documents? Do you have chain of custody? Do you have a story that flows together and your conformances are well laid out? Because one thing is you can do all the things right, and then an audit comes in. If you're not prepared for that audit, you're going to have a hard time, especially EU MDR, right? You're trying to prove you're MDR compliant. You fail that MDR audit, you're not even getting to the next phase of a review of your device yet until you've proven you can comply. So, all of this, all of my advice is really all about being audit ready, because all of these are going to come back in an audit. Pre-market communication. So have you seen your seller have any pre-market communications, or do you plan on any pre-market communications, right? If you're going to acquire it, you want to generate some buzz. Well, first off, we need to avoid safety and effectiveness claims. You can't be saying, hey, our device is designed to be safe and effective for this. Well, no, it's designed to do something else. Safe and effective is what comes when you've proven it. And so making sure you're saving that type of dialogue for the appropriate time, for the appropriate post-market time. Have you had investor communications? Have they had investor communications? What do those look like? Have they been properly disclaimed? Are they making sure that certain communications are really forward-looking and it's clear that they're forward-looking? They're not taking advantage of the investor communications to try to get out a safety and effectiveness message, and making sure that they're buttoned up there. Have they had advisory boards? Do you plan to have advisory boards? Do you have NDAs signed? Are these physicians who can give you good input on your device, and you're not just kind of pre-selling, but you're really getting feedback that could ultimately make your medical product better? So pre-market communication is an important strategy. It's important to know what a seller has done, and as a buyer, it's important to know what you can do to get your product some buzz, but the appropriate buzz from a scientific community, from a, hey, there's something here, we want to help and partner with this company to get it out the door. And then obviously investors are important, right? This all takes a lot of funding. So proper communications in a pre-market setting with investors will set you up for success. So, labeling. I think labeling is where I see a lot of communication when there's an acquisition going on, especially of a post-market product. And so we all know labeling is very broad. And so what does that mean? Well, you have to review everything, right? Look at emails that you're able to get to. But the first thing is go to the websites, look at social media of the seller, look at anything on YouTube or anything that's else put out in the, in the internet that you can find, and say, how have they described this device? How have they discussed the use of it? Have they discussed the evidence? and understand that you've got to look as much as you can, because then you've got to put them all in the claims matrix, right? You're going to have two claims matrices. You're going to have one from the seller. You're going to have one from the buyer. The buyer is going to be comfortable with X and the seller is comfortable with Y. And you're going to have a difference, right? So there's going to be risk tolerance disparities that are going to come out of those claims matrices that you need to account for. And scrutinize substantiation. If I'm a buyer, the one thing I really want to look at is, okay, here's your claim. I think it's consistent with your labeling. Now show me your evidence. Oh, well, we didn't do a clinical study, but these doctors, they love it. And I would say that's great. And your device probably is doing that, but I can't make these claims if I can't substantiate them. And that's basic. And so from a regulatory standpoint, that's what I'm going to point out to my business. Yeah, they may say this, and this may be something that's true in the end, but until I can prove it's true, you can't state this. So don't be adding this into your business plan, your marketing plan, because we don't have substantiation yet. So once again, documenting everything that you can find and understanding, just like if you're doing your own product launch, a claims matrix with substantiation, limitations, you're going to do the same thing from an acquisition standpoint. So, did I go? We'll go to the poll actually first before I get down to some of the burning down risk. So if you have a chance, we'll open up the poll and we're going to talk about what are the most difficult issues to spot. If you've been a part of due diligence, whether it's you're in the regulatory role, regulatory counsel role, or business or GC or anything, what do you find difficult to spot? Is it a quality system issue, device classification, marketing communications that maybe looked fine, and then after the acquisition, you're like, oh no, we really can't say some of the things I thought we could. There could be another, feel free to comment in the chat. But from an audience perspective, what are some things that you find difficult when you're doing due diligence from a regulatory standpoint?
All right. Can you hear me? No.
And Amanda's just about to let us know the result.
Hello? Oh, wow, yes. Okay, sorry, I have the poll results. 47% said quality system, 33% said marketing communications, and 13% said device classification, and then a handful said other.
Yeah.
So most quality system, which makes sense, and then marketing communications.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I think quality system it's just so broad, so many documents that things get missed, and I think that's why having adequate time. Some acquisitions might be 2 weeks. It's a quick process that shows up, a quick opportunity, and looking at a high level. But really the only thing that fixes the quality system concerns is time to dig through things and to have quality experts in the room. But no, it's good to see that my assumptions are at least proven correct in this limited poll, because I think that it's just the most onerous and the most numerous area to look. Even though marketing communications everywhere, they're usually pretty easy to find, and they kind of tell their own story once you see it. So burning down some risk. So proper issue spotting, right? As attorneys, we're always issue spotting, and it's no different here. We're always looking for issue spottings on misclassification, being in front of FDA, helps that. But if there's a disagreement in the assessment of a classification of a device, knowing that early is going to save a lot of work. Misbranding, adulterate, right? Those are very broad terms, but some of the ways that can happen, the change control process, being robust there, the marketing communications, and then quality system deficiencies. Being able to spot those is going to save a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of unhappy people on the back end. So be proactive. If you're going to burn down it, be proactive, right? If you know that there's an issue with the classification, don't kind of shy around and try to hope you can make it fit. Point it out right away. Then understand the timing and the effort to make these changes, right? If you're a business, if you know that something's going to take $10 million in 2 years, early on in the process, it's way easier to budget for that, both from a marketing outlook standpoint and from a raising your money standpoint. So maybe it won't be digestible in the end, but it's more likely to be if you can understand early on and be proactive how much money it's going to cost and what the time will take. Address all issues, no matter how small, right? The key that I said earlier is being audit ready. Audits look for all issues, right? You might not get a major finding, but you can get a finding, and findings have to be addressed, and they can turn to CAPAs, which turn to money and time. So address all issues, no matter how small. So some key takeaways. Ensure you have adequate time for a full review. Right now, That doesn't always mean you're going to have time for full review, but make sure you have adequate time for the things you're saying you're going to review, right? If it's a 1 week, you say, I can't do a full quality system, that's not a full review from what your standpoint is, but it's what you're able to give. So make sure you're verbalizing that, writing that down and saying, hey, I have 1 week. Here's the issues that I'm seeking to spot because these are the most damaging to our prospects moving forward. Understand the business goals. Make sure you know what the business wants to do afterwards. Like I've said, there's a big difference between someone who wants to turn around a market on day one and someone who wants to acquire the technology for something 5 years down the road. A major difference, and understanding that will make things a lot easier on the plans that you go forward. And once again, I'm going to keep it always saying this: address all issues. A lot of issues can be fixed after the acquisition, right? Not every issue has to be fixed before, but making sure you document them and follow them will make it a lot easier in the back end. And then finally, my last slide, for targets, don't neglect your quality system. If you want to sell and you want to get bought by a player, the more robust your quality system, the easier it is to prove what you're going to do and prove what your device will do, and the more confidence it will give that buyer. So make sure you address the quality system early, document as you go along using proper good documentation practices. Have regulatory assessments. Make sure that you have a rationale for what you're telling those buyers about your product, because it's a lot stronger proposition to go and say, hey, I've had an independent expert come in and they agree with my assessment, than just me saying, hey, our device is 510(k) exempt, don't worry about it. You can just see from a buyer and seller standpoint, some of those independent documents, those assessments give you a lot more confidence. And avoid limiting future potential. And that's really making sure you can realize the full breadth of that product, but that's going to come with understanding classification decisions, indication decisions, and all that comes with that. So, it's a very difficult and a very nerve-wracking time to be as part of an acquisition. But from a regulatory standpoint, understanding where your risks are, understanding how to burn down those risks, making sure that you consider the timing and the resources needed will really help you be more successful. Once again, reach out if you ever have any questions on this. I was happy to be here, and I'm happy to take any questions. I know I'm right at time, or a couple minutes past, but if there's any questions.
Sorry. When you say acquirers, do you mean like a larger medtech firm acquiring products from a smaller firm?
I mean,
And
that's usually how it goes.
challenges?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, oftentimes the bigger players will buy smaller technologies that fit within their portfolio.
Okay. The other challenge, that I see is the change control that you are talking about. A lot of times, when there is a change or a patch, they want to deliver the product to the market as early as possible. And the CAPAs and non-conformances, these documentation are always done like retrospectively later, like a
Yeah.
catch up. And it's a constant challenge to, let them know the importance that should
Yeah.
not be the way.
Yeah. No, I agree. And it's tough.
Yeah.
And there's a few things, right? Like there's control plans that you can get with in front of FDA that limit the amount of times you have to submit. So I think being proactive there and identifying your kind of device. If you're an AI device, software device, you have a ton of changes. And so the more you can package those into single submissions or annual report, because you've already agreed with FDA that these types of changes are annual reportable, the more you can stave off some of those concerns. But at the end, if you've got a device change that requires submission or should have gone through a CAPA and a good root cause analysis before implementing a change, you just have to have patience, right? And that's where it's tough from a regulatory standpoint, is because the business says we need to get this out, but the ramifications of going out too soon are an adulterated product. And so making sure they understand the seriousness of that is important.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good morning. Happy to be here in Boston today. And hello to those of you online. My name is Amanda Johnston. I'm a partner at Gardner Law, and I've been here for a little over 5 years. Previously worked in-house at a couple medical device companies. I primarily focus on healthcare compliance and regulatory strategy and submissions. So today we are going to talk about honesty and whether honesty is the best policy. So in addition to being a lawyer. I am also a full-time mother of 2 little boys, and I have a funny story that I wanted to share. So in the interest of kind of thinking about whether honesty is the best policy, because I say that to my kids all the time, um, I have a 6-year-old and a 10-year-old, 2 little boys. They're very curious. And last week we noticed that one of our phone charging cords was cut in half. And I had some suspicions as to who did it, who was the guilty party. We actually happened to have a Ring camera set up in the room, so we saw the whole thing on video. So it was like a 24-hour, investigation basically, where I was like, one of you has to fess up. It was one of you, one of the 2 boys. And it was, I think, 20 hours into that, one of my oldest son finally said, I did it, I'm sorry. And so we had the whole talk about honesty being the best policy. And, he should have told me, right away. That would have, been way better. You wouldn't have gotten in trouble, all these things. So it's just interesting that now we can apply this to the medical device industry and the healthcare industry when you're acquiring or involved in an M&A transaction. So just kind of an interesting parallel. So today we're going to talk about the DOJ's M&A Safe Harbor. We're going to talk about some of the benefits and the risks associated with the policy. I have a hypothetical scenario that we'll talk through and kind of look at the factors to consider and potential effects on just M&A activity in the industry as a whole, and then key takeaways. So the M&A Safe Harbor is one of several policies that the DOJ has initiated. They really want companies to raise their hand. Like I wanted my son to raise his hand right away as soon as he did something wrong. They want them to raise their hand and tell the DOJ. So it's an interesting concept, but it really is to encourage transparency. And again, kind of like what I tell my son, you wouldn't have gotten in as much trouble if you would have told me right away. So that's kind of what the policies are intended to address. So this was announced in October 2023, so it's been about a year by the DOJ. It's a DOJ-wide policy. So just some of the basics. So if you're in an M&A transaction and you're doing due diligence and the acquiring company finds misconduct, under the policy, you have to disclose that misconduct to the DOJ within 6 months of the closing of the acquisition. And that's regardless of whether you found it during due diligence or after the acquisition. So that's the first kind of timeline to remember, 6 months. And then you have to fully remediate all of the misconduct within 12 months. And if you do that, and if you cooperate, and fully cooperate, fully remediate within that 6 to 12 month range, the DOJ has announced that they will presumably decline to prosecute the acquiring company for the misconduct. There's a little bit of flexibility. There's some aggravating factors that the DOJ talks about. They also talk about, those timelines may shift depending on the conduct disclosed. So they've indicated that they want to work with companies because, again, they want you to raise your hand to kind of admit to your misconduct. Aggravating factors are, if senior leadership is orchestrating or involved in the misconduct, if there's patient harm, if the activities are egregious, or if they're pervasive, is it all levels of the company, but also if there is a recidivism issue. So if it's been an issue recurring, that could be an aggregating factor, and those aggravating factors could impact kind of the actual final result, whether you maybe get a lighter penalty, or they may decline to prosecute altogether. So that's the basics. So some benefits. I mean, obviously, if you comply fully, you do the 6 months, you do the 12 months, you're cooperative, you're making friends with the DOJ, you presumably will not be prosecuted. And that's the presumption of declination to prosecute. So we're looking at more favorable outcomes for the company if there is misconduct found. There's predictable timelines. We have the 6 month and the 12 month. So at least we can kind of think about planning. Can we meet those deadlines? it could also be used to safeguard against reputational damage. So you could, proactively, you could spin it and message it such that you are, and not spin it in that way, but that you are, you're a responsible corporation, you are, wanting to help the DOJ, and you can use that kind of to prevent reputational damage by demonstrating corporate responsibility. Another benefit for kind of in-house compliance is this is another tool kind of in your tool belt to use to make an argument to invest in compliance, especially in smaller companies where they may want to be a target company to be acquired. So risks, I mean, anytime you raise your hand and say, oh, I did something bad, the DOJ could look into other areas. You have to think about what you're disclosing. They may start pulling threads and be getting into kind of lines of activity that weren't included in the original disclosure, but then kind of being added on. You can't go back. So once you raise your hand, you can't, say, never mind, actually, we're good, just kidding. So it is a final kind of definitive proactive step. And it is a presumption that they won't prosecute. It's not a guarantee. So there's a little bit of uncertainty there. And then, what happens if you discover other issues? So as you're remediating, you come across, another activity that is violative. Do you disclose that too, or do you kind of keep that quiet and remediate together? So just some things to think about when you're deciding whether to disclose. And if you don't disclose, what are the odds that the DOJ or the regulator will find it anyway? If they find it and you didn't disclose, there may be a little bit more penalty there. The whistleblower risk might be increased if everyone at the target or acquiring company kind of knows about the misconduct and you've decided not to disclose. There still may be people within the company that think that it's something that they should raise their hand on. And if any of those things happen, whether it's a whistleblower or the DOJ finds out on its own, the penalties are likely to be more severe because you can't use the safe harbor policy. So is honesty the best policy? We're going to go through some factors, but I'm going to read a hypo just to kind of give us a little bit of facts to think about. All right, so Sterling Medical Solutions, and these are all fictitious. If it sounds like anything, it was purely coincidental. Sterling Medical Solutions is a prominent medical device manufacturer. They specialize in surgical equipment, and they are targeted to acquire Precision Health Tech, a smaller company known for its advanced imaging devices. The due diligence process was like 3 days. During that process in the data room, Sterling's legal and compliance team uncovers some concerning internal documents and emails at Precision. These documents reveal a pattern where Precision has been providing incentives such as all expense paid trips and luxury items and gifts to healthcare providers, seemingly in exchange for purchasing their products and promoting them to patients. Based on the document review, it looks like this has been primarily in the regional sales team, targeting a handful of high volume hospitals and clinics. The incentives doesn't look like they have been properly documented in any agreement or contract, so it's hard to trace. But there had also been some internal whistleblower complaints that surfaced internally at Precision, which seemingly were not addressed, investigated, and kind of were swept under the rug. So despite kind of these findings, the company's reported steady growth, which made the acquisition appealing to Sterling, and the deal is supposed to close in 4 days. So upon learning of that misconduct and kind of at least getting the briefing from the Sterling's legal and compliance team, the leadership is faced with a decision. Do we proceed with the acquisition? And if we do, should we disclose under this safe harbor policy, or should we not disclose? So we'll kind of go through some of the factors. So nature and severity of the misconduct. So what are the violations? With Sterling, we're looking at probably in a kickback statute, False Claims Act. There may be others. How widespread? So you'd want to look at, is it just the regional sales directors? Is it the entire sales team? Is there any evidence that, in terms of the aggravating factors, how pervasive was it? Was senior leadership involved? Did they know? Did they kind of look the other way? All things to think about, and you may not have time to track all this down, if there's a short due diligence time frame. Is there any patient harm? Any customer harm? Things to think about. Are there any mandatory disclosure requirements where you'd already be required to disclose something related to it? That might weigh in favor of relying on that safe harbor policy. Timing and disclosure requirements. So again, there's that 6 month. It has to be disclosed 6 months after the closing, regardless of when you found it. So theoretically, you could, maybe what if you find it 5 months after closing? Then your timeline is shorter there, because we're still doing this. We still have to consider the 12-month remediation timeline. Is it something that can be disclosed? Can you get, everything together and agree on what you will disclose within that 6-month window? It's a lot of work. Is it feasible to fully remediate in 12 months? Remediation can be incredibly expensive, time consuming, resources. You'd have to factor that in, those costs and timelines into the due diligence process and thinking about what you want to do. Of course, penalties. So there's potential fines, penalties, successor liabilities, kind of weighing the risks of whether it could be found out on its own, or whether the DOJ could find out on their own, or if there's a whistleblower risk, aggravating factors. If you don't disclose, you may have the full successor liability, whereas if you disclose and cooperate, presumably will not be prosecuted. Reputational risks. So just thinking about impacts in the market with reputation, how can that impact? It could demonstrate corporate responsibility, impact on future business. Will it impact your customer base? Will stakeholders, investors? The risk of discovery. So if you don't disclose, is it likely to be discovered? How easy is it to discover? With Sterling, or in the case of Precision, there's presumably a bunch of customers that also, receiving and were participating in this. So there may be less control over that situation that you'd want to consider. Risk management, it can be used to de-risk as a risk management tool. If a company has a strong risk management program, you can kind of control the narrative with you can attempt to control the narrative in terms of what you're disclosing and what you're proactively putting out there, versus getting a CID out of nowhere and having to kind of scramble and be reactive. Think about alternative strategies. So there may be scenarios where there's misconduct found, but it's not widespread, it's limited to a team or a single practice. Companies may choose to just remediate it quietly and document it and kind of run it through their compliance program that way. So just thinking about kind of the big picture in terms of what impacts this M&A self-disclosure policy will have on the industry. And there's nothing public in terms of if anyone has actually used this safe harbor policy. So we'll have to wait and see. I'm assuming that they will issue a press release if there's a company that does use it, because they'll want to use it to demonstrate how great the policy is. But it might lead to increased due diligence and scrutiny. Acquiring companies maybe want to take deeper looks at compliance, especially when it relates to AKS and False Claims Act violations. There might be a disproportionate impact on smaller companies who don't yet have the robust compliance program set up. They might, if you're smaller, you might be a less attractive target then. If there's a ton of remediation work that would have to go into it, the valuation could be affected as well. Acquiring companies like I mentioned, might have a narrower acquisition focus. They may not be willing to look in certain industries where there's high risk practices. Compliance can actually be a deal breaker, and we've seen that happen. We have clients that have walked away from deals based on misconduct. It could lead to prolonged timelines with due diligence and closing. There could be some innovation stifled based on risk aversion, so not willing to take risks from a compliance perspective or regulatory perspective that could impact innovation negatively. And then again, the post-acquisition remediation, if you have to do that, it has to be quick, focused, which is very difficult to do depending on the activities. That's taking attention away from the business activities. So that we could see companies focusing more on remediation efforts and not focusing on innovation and education and selling products. So key takeaways, this is just another policy among, I think, 3 or 4 other policies where the DOJ really is trying to get companies to raise their hand. It's good to invest early in compliance. Think about it, even if it's a small company, there are steps that you can take to at least start working towards a compliance program. We do that all the time with small companies or single companies. Understand that you're not going to have a huge compliance team, but at least having that mindset and having that be a topic of consideration. It's important. Think about this safe harbor policy before you start due diligence if you're an acquiring company. Have a discussion about, hey, what if we find something? What, maybe walk through some hypotheticals and think about what the impacts would be of disclosing or not disclosing. Because once you've identified that misconduct, that's when you have that decision. And then what would you do if you find misconduct? Would you walk away? And then what happens, to the target company after that? Are they going to have reputational damage if a deal fell through and they don't want to say why? Involve compliance from the start. So in the DOJ press release where this policy was outlined, they spoke heavily on the responsibility of the compliance officer and the general counsel to make sure that compliance has a seat at the table, at the M&A table. So there's a lot, they're putting all that on the compliance officer's shoulders to really make a seat at the table. So reiterating again that compliance is just very important, especially in M&A discussions. Proactive compliance will likely boost your valuation and maybe make you a more attractive target. And again, you can be small and still have a good, effective compliance program. And then just remember that compliance can make or break a deal. And I have a poll. So based on what we talked about today, so Sterling Medical is the acquiring company, Precision Health Tech is the smaller one. If you're on the deal team at Sterling, what would you do? Proceed with the deal, disclose, proceed with the deal but don't disclose, or walk away from the deal? And obviously there's lots of other considerations, but just curious to get you guys' thoughts. Yeah, no, that's fine. What about you guys in the audience? Would anybody disclose? I mean, it's hard without more information. I know, there's not a lot of details. I mean, it was a scheme among the regional sales team targeting a handful of high volume hospitals and clinics. Yep. Seems to be, yes. Yep. But it's intentional. And remember they dismissed the whistleblower complaints, swept them under the rug. Yes, exactly. Yep.
You see how critical that deal is for you? It's critical, I think, option 1.
Right. The closing date? Yeah. Right, yeah, it's seemingly yes, yep.
All right, the results online are 56% would proceed, 13 would proceed with the deal, but not disclose, and 31% would walk away.
So 50% would disclose.
56%.
Wow, okay. The DOJ would be very happy to hear that. Yeah. Yeah, and it will, I mean, it affects the deal structure for sure. Potential evaluation. No, I don't think they would not say that. They wouldn't direct you to take it or not. They might have opinions on that, but. Right. So then if you're thinking of like the remediation efforts, are we gonna have to fire our entire sales force and retrain? Like can we do that all in 12 months? And how much money do we have to do this? So you can see there's just a lot of considerations. I think a lot of companies would automatically, if we bring up self-disclosure with clients, they're automatically like, no, we're not, you're not raising our hand. But there may be a time and place when it is appropriate and you believe the benefits outweigh the risks. Yes. Mhm. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. That's very true. Right.
One of the slide you had, connected to your risk mitigations,
Yeah.
and
Yep.
that was great. I think that will help with proceeding with the deal, but also mitigate the risk
Yes.
that you foresee
Yep.
there. Yeah.
Yep. I think honestly the challenge, I think people probably would disclose more if we have examples of DOJ not like expanding the scope, and because then you're embroiled in essentially an investigation with the DOJ that you invited. You invited them to your home. So I mean it is going to be a distraction. So if they have more, yeah, I think companies are really hesitant to raise their hand and invite the DOJ inside. So it would be interesting to see if that's why I think they could make this more viable, is just kind of some examples of how they limited their scope. They didn't go start looking for other things, that it was successful. And even hearing from a company, I've never seen, I don't know if you guys have seen a company really issue, any statement about how the process was great and they, felt they were glad they disclosed. I haven't seen that. So, I mean, you could spin that and make it a good announcement, but I don't think it's very common. That's my guess. Any questions online?
What advice would you give small startups that don't yet have a compliance program in place?
Yeah, and so I talked about that a little bit. I mean, when you're small, you have, it could be 1 to 10 employees. Understandably, you don't have a compliance program in place, but there are things that you can do. You can start thinking about policies and procedures. You can engage, if you have a friend or a consultant or a legal expert in the compliance area, there are little steps that you can take. Compliance policies, just naming someone as the person to kind of stay in touch with compliance activities, start thinking about a compliance program. It could be a part-time role or even a quarter-time role in the beginning. But just even having that documentation that you've thought about it or you've discussed it, I think those are the key things until you get big enough to, of course, if you're commercializing, then that would be a different timeline, but at the beginning, just kind of start small baby steps. All right. Thank you guys. I'll pass it over to Paul.
Just going to adjust this here a little bit. All right.
Well, good morning. I think it's still morning everywhere that we're broadcasting to. Glad to be here. I'm excited to talk to you about cybersecurity, and we'll be talking about it mostly from the data protection and on that side of things. But as you know, cybersecurity impacts a lot of different products as well in the med device space. So we'll have a little bit of discussion on that as well. A little bit about me, and we'll find our clicker here. My background's in privacy and cybersecurity law. I've worked on HIPAA implementation, compliance, GDPR, other state and federal privacy laws, a lot of auditing, program implementation, various things in both privacy and cybersecurity. Today, our goal is ultimately to walk away with a better understanding of the landscape around cybersecurity, what's happening in the life sciences industry, the med device industry in terms of cybersecurity, and then further get into some specific impact on M&A that this may have or does have. And then also, what are some ways to avoid pitfalls that might come into play during due diligence or M&A transactions that are driven by cybersecurity risk. And then we'll also go through briefly some examples of questions or due diligence requests that we might see, whether it's from the sell side and trying to anticipate what those requests would be, or ways to look at this from the buyer side. So what's going on in cybersecurity right now for life sciences companies? Obviously, there is no difficulty in looking around the news and finding examples of data breaches, and life sciences is no exception to that. We have breach upon breach and some very significant ones over the past year or two. And I just want to highlight these. And I think one thing that's important to remember is these companies are not always at fault. They're often victims, and generally are victims of attacks from cyber criminals who are very experienced, hardened experts in this area. And there's nation states and very difficult challenges in defending against these attacks. So this is not to point the finger at any companies, but to simply outline some of the things that have happened and try to learn from that to better protect our companies going forward. So one example last year that was very significant was a data breach at Zoll Medical, and this involved email compromise, so not systems of the company that were processing data in a kind of organized way, but emails. So this came through an email phishing attack. There was a loss of data through that affected potentially around 1 million individuals based on a submission to the Massachusetts through a cybersecurity reporting report to the Massachusetts government. So this is just one example of a breach, and the impact is ongoing, as these typically take some time, not only to remediate, to investigate, to prepare, experts, bring in forensic folks to look through the data and evaluate what's happened, where did the access extend to, contain the breach, and then notify all these individuals, notify regulators, stakeholders, shareholders. And then once you're done with that, you still have the work of shoring up your company's security to improve and remediate from that point forward. And on top of that, there's business impacts, whether that's interruption in business, or it could be even things like lost revenue from a loss of trust or lack of trust from customers. So there's a lot of impacts that tail off of these that presumably would occur in this case as well. Another major breach was last October. LivaNova had about a month-long period from October to November before a breach was discovered. And once that was discovered, the containment process and investigation process began. And it was about 6 months until it was confirmed that patient information was breached during this this incident as well. A very significant impact. We don't have, as we typically is the case, we don't have a number on the total business impact, but disclosed by LivaNova in the Q4 financial filings, we can glean that there was a direct impact of about $2.6 million in that one quarter following the breach discovery. And obviously since then, no doubt there's additional costs incurred through notifications and all of those investigative processes and business impact, et cetera. And then another breach we can discuss briefly is the Henry Schein breach that affected about 29,000 individuals. Now this breach in particular had a business interruption element that was discussed quite a bit in the news around this. And also something interesting here is that the company started to offer discounts on their products in order to directly, following the breach, help continue sales. Some finance analysts were estimating there may have been an impact of around 500 million in total revenue to this company through that incident. So again, not to point the finger at anyone, these are just examples of some very significant risks that cybersecurity vulnerabilities or even just attacks in general can have. And the obvious impact to M&A is that these directly impact valuation. They directly impact reputation of companies, whether it's an acquiring company following a breach, or if a breach occurs shortly after an acquisition, perhaps the company that's assigned responsibility becomes the acquiring company. So there are definitely some implications for M&A, and we've seen that historically through, for example, the Verizon acquisition of Yahoo a number of years ago. There was a direct discount when a breach was discovered in the middle of a transaction of about 8% of the valuation. So these do have direct impacts on valuation during acquisitions. Another area that this can have an impact is devices and safety and effectiveness of those devices. So cybersecurity in this context is a little bit different, right? This isn't about protecting the company information from outsiders, but protecting a particular product, whether that product is a cloud connected product or a more isolated programmable implant, something like that. In any event, these are all devices that have cybersecurity risk. And so it's critical to recognize having a process in place, having systems in place to defend and protect that product, anticipate risk is critical. These are actually examples, I think, in a positive light of companies proactively identifying we have a vulnerability here that we've noted through our systematic process, whether that's internal activity or they're paying attention to outside input on those vulnerabilities. However that's discovered, these are examples of companies proactively addressing that. So we see the example here of Medtronic self-disclosing to the FDA and anticipating we have this vulnerability, here's how we're addressing it, and ensuring that patient safety is supported through self-disclosure and anticipation of that risk. Similarly, BD had another similar approach. We identified cybersecurity vulnerabilities, and this is what we did to address it. The reason I raise these is because think about this in terms of an M&A transaction. You're looking at a company, they have a device that's connected, so there's cybersecurity concerns or issues that could come up. Well, do they have a process in place that anticipates these? Is there a risk assessment that's documented? Was that put in a file after submission and forgotten about, or are they still continuing to evaluate what risks are present now? Are we patching this device? Are those things continuing? These are ways that this could impact M&A directly. So let's talk about the impact a little further. So what about cybersecurity in terms of if versus when? I think a lot of times we think of cybersecurity as well, if there's a breach or if there's an issue that comes up. But in M&A, I think a better way to think about this is what will we find, or what is there, and do we know about it? Every single system, every company has some vulnerabilities. Think of it a little bit like the body's immune system. Security and cybersecurity are risk-based practices. They're not black and white rules that protect a company or a product from any vulnerability or threat. It's a constant flowing give and take of preparation and then exploitation, and trying to anticipate where is the exploitation going to occur and getting there first, and preparing your systems or your software to deflect that. So if you're doing due diligence and you identify 0 cybersecurity issues, you've probably missed something, and there's probably some risk that's been missed. So think about it from that perspective and attempt to find where is that risk up front. Recognize that the average cost of a breach, and this is again, not the business impact, but specifically when we have a breach and we have to respond to that and then investigate it, mitigate that, and do reporting. The cost of a breach in healthcare is approximately about 9.8 million in the US right now, based on a IBM report that's an annual report they publish on data breach costs. The cost per record, and this isn't healthcare specific, but it's generally around $180 per record. So there's a significant cost directly from breaches, not even mentioning business impact like we noted in that previous example with some of the companies that have experienced these breaches. And then on top of that, if you're on the selling side, cybersecurity is a trending M&A area of scrutiny. So we're seeing questions on this pretty consistently. And I'll pause. We have a question, it looks like.
A couple questions. First, do you know, has there ever been a malicious attack on embedded device software? And what is your view on the risk that poses? Once again, that's a malicious attack on embedded device software.
Yeah, and if you could clarify embedded device, meaning you have an implant and there's software that supports that device directly, or I'll assume that's probably the case. To date, we haven't actually seen an attack on a person's device that we've identified as causing harm to date. There have been concerns about that. You can think of the Dick Cheney example a number of years ago, where his I think it was a pacemaker or some similar device, defibrillator perhaps. They were concerned someone might get next to him with do some sort of direct interference with that device. We haven't seen someone interfere with the programming in a way that we've identified and noted as a cyber attack.
Does the FDA's enhanced guidance on cybersecurity for devices and software as a medical device improve the ability to do diligence on acquisition targets?
I think so. What is helpful about those guidances, especially the last couple of years, is that there's a more specific framework to compare to. I think in the past, it was definitely a part of the safety and effectiveness process to, hey, we have risk assessment, we look at software, bill of materials, or other things to try to identify risk. But having a framework to say, do you have this particular kind of documentation in place is helpful, definitely. So yes, these are definitely good questions, and feel free to ask more as we go. So increased scrutiny is a thing. We are seeing more questions about cybersecurity as we move forward. So another thing to kind of keep in mind is costs, but also resources. So when we have a cybersecurity issue that's identified, let's assume even if a breach hasn't occurred, but we find a vulnerability, this should affect valuation. It will affect remediation once the acquisition occurs, and there will be integration costs that are increased if the cybersecurity posture of the target company is not on par with the company acquiring it, which is very common in deals where it's a smaller, less sophisticated company. Usually the target company carries very little cybersecurity risk in terms of a breach, because once the acquisition is complete, their reputation isn't on the line. They don't have the sophistication and cybersecurity controls that acquiring company typically would have. So there should be impacts to valuation. Remediation costs should be taken into account, the effort, the resources, and the integration costs. And another thing that's interesting is there's been a trend of increased threat. So when a deal is announced, companies are seeing increased activity or attempts to breach their networks and systems after a deal is announced. And presumably that's because criminals are seeing this as they are in transition. There's some changes occurring. There might be staff transitions or layoffs or other things that occur around that deal that might impact cybersecurity preparedness, or even integration work that leads to reprogramming or changes to the systems that again could increase those vulnerabilities, and then therefore the threat is increased. So going back to the point about it's not so much an if, but it's a what is vulnerable. I think tied with this increased threat, there's a significant risk to be concerned about. So just for a moment, let's do a poll and ask, so if you're on the acquiring side or on the selling side, are you seeing cybersecurity in diligence requests, or are you using cybersecurity? So if you've seen it, raise your hand here. Otherwise, you can answer the poll online. I see a few, yeah, a couple in the audience, but yeah, we've definitely been seeing that regularly, even sometimes when it seems out of left field for the product that's being acquired. Any?
Right now, it's yeah, 71% have seen it in the
Okay.
online.
Yeah, that sounds about right to me. So it is a major area of scrutiny, especially right now when products have any connectedness to the internet, or if there's significant patient information being collected, it becomes a major area. Whether that's through patient education programs and pipelines, direct to consumer kind of marketing, or reimbursement programs and hubs, things like that tend to increase risk around data breaches and so forth. So what are some pitfalls to avoid? Obviously take it seriously. Cybersecurity is a significant risk area in this space. We've already talked about some of these areas of cost, and also there are a lot of regulators that are directly involved in cybersecurity. So that comes from, the FTC has been very active on the cybersecurity enforcement front. We're seeing numerous cases where they're taking action on after breaches, or even just when there's some more run-of-the-mill privacy issues. But in cybersecurity, particularly, it's post-breach. State attorney general involvement. We're seeing, obviously in HIPAA, the HHS may become involved, especially post-breach, in determining fines and so forth. One I'd note too is the Security Exchange Commission is becoming more engaged when it comes to transparency around cybersecurity incidents and the impact on finances and so forth. So filings with the SEC are definitely something to consider whenever dealing with cybersecurity risks and incidents. Then of course, understand the target that you're dealing with. So if you have so much of a budget to do due diligence, take a risk-based approach and understand what is the industry. So where are the key risk areas? Is there a patient database? Is there a CRM that has a significant amount of patient data? Are there products that are connected or have other key risk areas when it comes to cybersecurity? So take a risk-based approach, look at the areas that really are the most significant in terms of risk. And then again, assume some vulnerabilities that you identify may be exploited. Just because a breach hasn't been identified already or occurred yet does not mean that the risk is zero. Those things can take place. And as we saw in one of the examples early on from the news, there's the potential for months to go by without a breach actually being confirmed. And that can be just as damaging or even more damaging. If you look at these IBM cost reports, the costs are actually increased when companies take longer to identify breaches. So these controls that need to be in place can significantly mitigate the costs as well. A few other things. So as we mentioned, no breach does not equal no risk. So it's really difficult to be certain, especially if you don't have the controls in place, that someone's entered a system, right? If the logging is not set up to identify unusual access patterns, you might not even know, even months or even a year later, that someone's been in the system until you get that ransomware attack or notification from the FBI that we found your data on the dark web or something like that. Consider alternative methods for vetting targets. So you might consider hiring firms that can support, say, a dark web search or some other activity to look for signs of a breach within the target. For example, there are forums on the dark web where a criminal can post, I found data from X company, here's how much it costs to buy the records. If that is the case, you may have someone who can help you find that kind of information and confirm, is this real data or is it a fake posting, those kinds of things as well. And then also along with that, in that same vein, take a multidisciplinary approach to diligence. So legal is important to have at the table to look at some of those kind of basic risks. We can ask the questions, look at the policies, help identify the scope, maybe look at contracts, especially if it's a service provider business that needs to allocate risk for cybersecurity issues through contract, but also get the CISO involved or other cybersecurity professionals, IT. Think about architecture. How do these integrations work to make sure security is established throughout the whole deal? And then engineering or security professionals who understand the device. If there's a device involved or a connected device, get the right people at the table to look at that and understand, are there potential safety or effectiveness issues that could come from a cybersecurity perspective? So wrapping up here, and I think we've got just a couple minutes here. Here's some example requests that you might use, and not exhaustive, but some things that might help you identify some of these risks or lines of inquiry that you could use to dig deeper from there. But things like looking for documentation demonstrating that the company does have a functioning information security program, or on the device side, is there documentation of a total product lifecycle approach to cybersecurity? So from release to how do we sunset this device ultimately to deal with cybersecurity issues on that end? Do we continue to monitor cybersecurity throughout the life of the device? All of these things are relevant to evaluating cybersecurity risk during an M&A transaction. Some more example requests. So for example, a big area of risk in cybersecurity right now is software development. So if your company or the target company is developing software, there could be some areas within that development process that leave vulnerabilities. That's a very common attack vector is software development, because really it's coding, and any coding that's especially in-house, it may not be tested the same way that it might be if it's produced by off the shelf like Salesforce or Amazon, some of these organizations that have huge amounts of resources to dedicate to software development. So these are areas that can be very vulnerable. So looking at the software development process can be very critical to understanding the cybersecurity risk at the target company. Or if you're on the sell side, do you have these processes in place? Are you thinking about cybersecurity not only from a safety and effectiveness standpoint, which is, I think, common, to focus there first as a product development enterprise, but then also, is the data protected? Does our company have the right systems in place to protect from a data breach, like we noted early in the presentation? So again, these are just some examples, but there could be more areas of questioning if needed, or you could focus specifically on these things. So to wrap up, just to, again, there's a lot of risk when it comes to cybersecurity. There could be a breach at any time in any company, but there are ways to mitigate those risks. And there's some proven ways to really reduce the risks. So taking into account particularly how you invest and think about how you invest in terms of your diligence resources, I think cybersecurity does deserve some of that, and take some consideration around who should be at the table for these conversations, who do you need to talk to at the target company to get a good picture of their cybersecurity posture. And then remember, data breaches, these are the tip of the iceberg, but cybersecurity is so much more than that. There could be vulnerabilities that are under the surface, and this is what diligence is designed to find. Take a risk-based approach. There's only so much available, as you all know, if you've done work in this area, to investigate and look into a company from a diligence perspective. So take a risk-based approach, understand what are you looking at and what are the key risk areas, and deploy the right experts. Make sure that it's not just legal or it's not just IT, but there's a blend of the right sorts of expertise at the table to look at all these issues. And then lastly, again, I want to remind you to think about this from a vulnerabilities that are identified or not identified could be more likely to be exploited following a transaction announcement. So keep that in mind, that typical threat may be increased beyond the base threshold simply because of the M&A activity involved. So pause there. Any questions or more questions from the audience or from you guys?
You said have cyber liability insurance certificate. So do companies purchase insurance to save themselves from the data breaches and all those?
Yes, yeah. So more and more common now is this concept of cyber liability insurance. So if you have any sort of personal data or even company data that's at risk of breach, which is pretty much every company now, you can go and purchase a liability coverage policy that covers that. Typically, there's parameters that go along with, or requirements that come along with that will be imposed by the insurance company. So you have to meet a bare minimum of cybersecurity requirements to even get the policy, but those do help cover from breaches. Yeah. All right. Thank you, everybody.
We're gonna take a 15-minute break and then start up at 11:45 Eastern time.
What's going on? I thought it was taller. I'm shrinking. I know, it's fine. I'm not-
Very
Sorry? No, no, I think it's, no, but good idea. Thank you. Otherwise, then you're good. I think we're waiting for the tech person. Here he is. Welcome back, everybody. I'm David Graham. I'm a litigator and regulatory lawyer. And well, I was tasked with talking about the Loper decision. I want you to you can put my slides up if you want. Nate's might be more useful actually, because I'm trying to apply this decision to due diligence. And so it's a layer of analysis that I think, a high level layer of analysis to evaluation of companies, both by a target if you're trying to get ready to be sold, or if you're a purchaser, because there's a new dynamic with, so we've had 40 years of, if a regulatory agency says something and makes an interpretation of a statute, and that's an ambiguous statute, that's the way it is, right? And the judges are told not to disturb that. Well, that's different now. We don't know exactly what's going to happen. I couldn't find a decision citing Loper yet. That's how new it is. So I unfortunately can't use up my time with war stories because there are none. And there's just wars to be fought. So next year, this would be a different interpretation based on a circuit's or a district court's decisions about fights over agency interpretations of statutes that individual companies might make, or consumer advocates or other groups that have an interest in our regulated or government regulation. So with that preface, then I am going to suggest that when you're entering a transaction, there is a layer of analysis that you can apply that we didn't have before, last 40 years. It's not that nobody did it, but what is it about this company, whether it's yours or one you're looking at, that might lend itself to less limitations on what it does, because things that that company might not have done in terms of expanding their market or how they marketed their products or the finances, how they were set up or how they interact with patients, how they advertise, might not be limited as much as before. So maybe it's a point of opportunity. One thing I will preface that the Loper decision will not impact is what Amanda talked about. If you're doing things illegally, most likely challenging the FDA's interpretation of a statute after the fact is not going to change how the DOJ looks at what you did and whether you'll be prosecuted or not prosecuted or whatever happens. So this is not a discussion about criminal or other liability under the various anti-fraud statutes. I just wouldn't look at it that way at all. Someday there will be a fight. The DOJ has to fight about that. And there was a little bit in the Trump case, right? So they changed their prosecutorial stance in the case relating to January 6th because of the decision. But I wouldn't, in the FDA context particularly, look at that as a panacea or some way to mitigate liability. Could be someday, but that's not what this is about. So we'll have to think about that later. So what are the objectives? Well, one is to understand the Loper decision. Well, first of all, the Chevron decision that it replaced, then talk about the Loper decision and what it means and why we have it, and then go on to try to drill down a little bit about how it might affect FDA-regulated company transactions. So that's basically the outline of the presentation, and so let's proceed there. So the Loper decision overturned Chevron deference doctrine. So this is a constitutional separation of powers resetting by the Supreme Court. And that's going to happen, has been happening with this court, and will happen in the future. And the resetting is a limitation of the executive branch in favor of the judicial branch. So what the court said in its largest interpretation is that the executive branch is exerting too much power when it has an expansive and unsupported interpretation of ambiguous statutes. And so that's generally what's going on. So a Supreme Court justice isn't necessarily, well, he's thinking about the particular facts of the Loper case, but he's also they're also thinking about, excuse me, they're also thinking about what's the general balance of power between the branches of government. So believe it or not, that will become apparent in what I'm going to talk about related to M&A transactions. So before there was deference to agencies, like I said, the assumption was the agencies have knowledge and experience, right? And they generally do. They deal with this stuff every day. There's expansive groups of people, FDA, EPA, FTC, SEC, that have to deal with these problems every day. And we should listen to what they say and rely on their interpretations of statutes. And agencies will do better than judges, because judges will have a case that comes up and all of a sudden they have to be an expert on some environmental problem or some FDA technology or some financial scheme related to SEC regulations or something like that. So why would we rely on the judges to interpret the statute when the agency has already done so? What the belief, I believe, by the court is that's left, it has left us with agencies applying, oh, sorry, no, I'm still, oh yeah, sorry, thanks. I was told to take cues about when I'm forgetting to advance the slide, because I always do. So what has happened is that the belief is there's been an expansion of jurisdiction by agencies with less and less evidence as time has gone by to support. So less evidence, greater distance from the original intent of the statute. And so that's part of why the decision was made and rendered. So what happened? So the judges decided to overturn the premise that the agency's interpretation of ambiguous statutes is to be deferred to by judges. The court said no. Judges' jobs, by virtue of the Constitution, is to interpret statutes, right? And decide if they're constitutional enough. That's a premise not only of the Constitution, but the Administrative Procedures Act. And so that's why we think now we have to go back to what the law was before 40 years ago. They did not, however, eliminate all decisions made in the past based on that assumption or on the Chevron doctrine. So don't think you can go back and suddenly unleash technologies and opportunities by challenging previous decisions made in the courts. And agency decisions are still important if to the extent it rests on factual premises within the agency's expertise. So that is to say that the agency's interpretation of statutes have to be based on evidence. So I'll keep using the word evidence when I'm a litigator. Two, it applies to what Nate was talking about, right? So all our businesses are based on evidence, scientific evidence and clinical trials and other things to prove that we have efficacy and safety. And so, so there has to be evidence supporting the FDA interpretations, specific evidence related to the specific issue at hand, not just sort of generally, well, we deal with this a lot and in our experience, it's been blah, 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 but it has to be more targeted. So that deference has to be specifically related to the facts of the case. So that's the new sort of, I mean, there's a lot more to the decision, but I wanted to try to distill it for you so we could sort of have a broader understanding of what we're dealing with. So what's the impact on the FDA? Well, most people think that the normal gather evidence, send it to the FDA, prove that your advice is efficacious and safe is not changing. It's so specific. So I want you to compare what we do, right? In terms of that process with determining whether a particular pollutant or something else will cause damage 40 years from now in climate change, right? So there's a big difference between having done clinical trials carefully and, for a particular disease process with a particular device or drug than making speculation about what might happen in the future, either in the ecological world or the financial world or something like that. So a lot of people think that the FDA, plus the FDA is a black box to a lot of the world, right? Including presidents of the United States, right? Senators, Congress people, right? It's so technical and and people are afraid to interrupt something that might negatively impact their safety. So if they really know what they're doing, they have doctors checking on what they're doing, why are we going to interrupt that? This will probably not affect food, the world of food and veterinary medicine. But the FDA will receive more challenges. So that gets us now to how we might analyze transactions. Already Congress sent to the FDA and EPA hundreds, if not thousands, of subpoenas for documents. They're thinking that they're going to go back and show the world and all the decisions made interpreting statutes that were wrong, upon which rules are being made that are improper, that are impacting industry or their constituents in a particular area of the country. And so the challenges have already started. I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't have a way to know if that's happening in court context, right, yet, since it's so new. But there now is an avenue to say to a court somewhere that, the FDA's rule that impacts my business was made on this interpretation of the statute. We think that interpretation's flawed or beyond their jurisdiction or whatever malady it might have. In court, we want you to correct that, which allows me to do X, right? Use this medical product for A instead of just B and C, or I should say B and C instead of just A, or something like that. So people will be seeking specific opportunities to target technology that they deem is bottled up or marketing opportunities by FDA rulemaking or SEC or FTC or whatever else might impact our businesses, including environmental practices, and we'll proceed that way. It also may slow down decisions. Now, in the world of healthcare, meaning broadly, your products that help people get better, there will always be the counter pressure, right? No, don't get in the FDA's way, right? Of things that we've been trying to speed up for decades, right? What's always been the challenge, right? So upon this discussion is the reality that FDA's work with food and medical devices and drugs is people are afraid of slowing it down. So there'll be always constituencies, diabetes association, heart association, other things that will be putting constant pressure on to not allow this change of paradigm to impact the development of technology that can be life-saving, life-improving, and whatever else. All the other good things that the med tech industry does for people. I wanted to, before we go on to more specifics of due diligence, there's other things that impact transactions, right? When you're looking at a target, there may be rules related to how it's financed. If you're a venture capitalist, right? What do I got to do? What is the SEC saying about what I got to do to inform people about things and put in disclosures and things like that? Now, there's a difference, obviously, between publicly traded and private business. I understand that. But there'll be challenges to SEC rules and FTC rules related to consumer protection and things like that, that may also impact how you view a transaction. And there also may be people challenging those potential hindrances to the transaction you're trying to make that you need to keep an eye on. So in the due diligence process, it's not just how does my specific technology, how is it being impacted by FDA rules and regulations that I might think are inappropriate, but how are other things going on in antitrust, consumer protection, privacy, and other things like that, where people are making challenges that might change the value of a company, or how I structure the transaction, and things like that. So I just mention those because obviously the industry rubs up against a lot of different roadblocks potentially, not just those of the FDA, but other regulatory agencies that impact med tech. So I mentioned those here. So questions to ask yourself as you're approaching the transaction. And I think that, you know, again, this is part of just taking a step back and seeing how the new landscape may benefit you. So I look at the decision as all potential opportunity, unless more challenges, which I forgot to mention at the beginning. So the assumption is that by the Supreme Court, that judges are going to make better decisions than the agency about ambiguous statutes that lead to rules that lead to. What I think they fail to get, that it's jurisdiction to jurisdiction, right? So you may get a judge in Minnesota that thinks completely differently, or California, than a judge in Texas or Alabama or somewhere else, right? I'm making assumptions I shouldn't make about those things, but so the forum shopping for judges is going to start immediately, and where you bring challenges. And a judge actually may have a more expansive and more view of FDA power or their authority, and may give more deference, right, that may not help, right, a particular technology or set of marketing rules or whatever is being challenged in the particular case. So that caveat has to be there to my otherwise Pollyannian view of this decision as a benefit to business. So the challenges are going to start. So you should look at, right? So part of your due diligence should be immediately to have somebody look at, you know, this is the main set of regulations that impacts this technology. Is anybody out there challenging them right now, right, that will benefit or hurt what I'm doing, right? And not a challenge in terms of a better technology or like that, but challenging the whole premise upon which limitations are placed on it. And if they are, you might want to figure out what's the likelihood that it'll be successful. What, how can we help if we, right? If we want to, right? Are we going to be part of that challenge? Are we going to join in the case? Is it worth the money at all, right? Or should we just wait? Or is it just a benefit that, well, if it comes along, that'll be great. That's just a bonus, right? And it doesn't really impact immediately what we're doing. You know, whether you should, then you should look at your specific company, right? And say, what in this company has happened that would, is being restricted, first of all, by some rules of the agency that you believed are improperly made because of their interpretation of the statute? And what do we have right? What in all the things that Nate outlined, right? So you can go back now to that PowerPoint slide. What about all those things are we been saying and have and evidence do we have that would possibly support a challenge, right? And there, that's why your due diligence then has another gloss, right? It's not just compliance, right? It's not just Amanda, protecting yourself against lawsuits because compliance plan wasn't very good, the quality wasn't very good, the documentation, even if it was all good, the documentation's not that good. So all of which have this defensive posture, right? And it's appropriate, and you got to protect investors, and you have to do all the appropriate things there. But now I suggest that there's a new way to look at it. Whereas, how is this evidence usable for a challenge that might expand the use of the technology, for example, or what we say about the technology that exists, right? Regulations on off-label usage or something like that, which is always up for grabs because of the First Amendment, but there might be another challenge here otherwise. So those are questions that I think you should ask. And ask your reviewers to ask and educate them about. So you have a bunch of people, right? Whether they're in a law firm or you're their own in-house counsel or a combination, who's ever doing the due diligence, to think about tactically how, if evidence is there, that would be helpful in some challenge, whether it happens now or later, or whatever, strategically, however strategically it fits into what you're doing. All right, so here's some due diligence focus areas, which I now would change this list completely. Even though I reviewed Nate's presentation first, didn't click into my head. These are the old law, right, due diligence areas, right, that really might not lead to finding evidence that might be helpful. But some of them I'll highlight. One that's not on there are the clinical studies, all what they should be, right? Are they good? Are they clean? Do they establish? What do they prove? Right? That's the most important. I mean, that's the evidence that FDA relies on at the end of the day. So compliance with laws. Right? You might view that as, oh my gosh, we've been doing this, this, and this, and our sales reps have been doing this, this, and this. And as the law stands and as the rules are, you might go, well, yeah, that's a little outside the rules, right? To what's happening. Maybe not to the extent Amanda outlined in her hypothetical, but, and then you might go, well, yeah, but there's these challenges going on to how we doing things, and this set, how we do this might fit into that challenge of the existing rules, and we should see how that plays out, or at least factor that into our analysis, right? So if you're doing your due diligence report, you'd say compliance with laws. Not really, but here's what's happening in the marketplace or in the legal marketplace that might show that this is within rules that might be changed because of court decisions. All really speculative, but important consideration. Communications with the FDA and agency, obviously, really important in the analysis based on the Loper decision. So what have you been telling them, right? About, have you been pushing, right? I know that might be a dumb question because we all push, right? But people have more conservative and liberal ways. They want to push the FDA to expand how they use technology and what they can say about it. So it's important to look at that information and make sure you understand what historically the company has done to communicate about its technology and business. So inquiries, reports, notices, and court. So has the company done a good job of tracking what's going on in the marketplace? In other words, is there evidence that the FDA's interpretation of the statute's irrational? Because if you just look at what the doctors are doing with this technology, remembering that the doctors can do whatever they want, as long as you're not telling them, mean, that's the general rule. Obviously, there's lots of shades of that, but isn't it obvious that the restriction on the use of the technology makes no sense based on what's going on in the field? And what's the communications about that? What's the record keeping about? People are afraid to keep records of what doctors are doing with their technology if it's not an approved use, right? I think that might change a little bit, right? You want to know, and it's not going to hurt you to have known, right? Because it's, again, it's not you, as long as you're not properly promoting it. Keeping track of it and showing how good it is doesn't mean you're filling brochures in doctors' offices with all these potential uses. It does help with evidence if you want to challenge the restriction. So those are some things, well, obviously marketing documents, right? So that's, always a dangerous area. Right? So you're hoping that those are not just in compliance, right? But that they're telling a story that you haven't been violating the rule willy-nilly, that would cut off any reasonable challenge, because they'll just say you're just trying to get out of liability for violating the rule, right? But if you're otherwise following the rules, then it's easier to make a challenge. So those are just some I highlight, other than Nate's list about quality and other actual scientific evidence, which will be the most helpful in any challenges that might be happening or that you might initiate. Questions?
How might challenges to FDA interpretations impact M&A volume generally?
How do they impact M&A volume? I would say very few up till now. I would say most people look at, evaluate their company and their targets, just assuming the FDA is never going to be challenged, and we have to live with that. So I would say that volume's low. Very few businesses now, and it may stay the same, right? We're talking about a world that hasn't been created yet, right? So we don't really know, but my answer to that would be very few. There would be no reason to, because the judge would go, well, that's what the FDA says, and they're there, right?
How about going forward though, looking into the future a little bit? If this starts to get relied upon, would you see being more opportunity for M&A because you think you can go in, and if you're a bit bigger player, you've got more resources to change decisions, or is it still, that's a lot of work and time, so it's not worth it?
No, I think it'll take years. So I would say in 3 years or 5 years, we're going to know what the courts are doing with this, right? Your hope is, from a business perspective, is there's less limitations on technology because FDA's challenges there in terms of how that should be used and when it should be used are succeeding, right? Rationally, we hope. We don't, right, want rules abandoned that endanger patients. That's not what we're suggesting, but rationally, right? So I think it'll increase, and I think it's a better opportunity for targets and people trying to build their portfolio in larger companies or private investment companies. All right, thank you.
Hey, we're just going to get ready for the panel here, and we'll start that in just a minute or so. I'll just kind of have the questions here and see what's added. I'll grab it. Okay, great. Great. For the seats, I'll just use these. Do you want us to angle the chairs towards the
Oh, okay.
Testing.
Test 1, 2.
Okay here.
All right, thanks. Well, we will jump into our panel here. So thank you, Alan and Irina, for joining us. Maybe we'll start with just quick bios, if you guys don't mind just giving your background to the audience.
Sure. I'm Irina Ridley. I'm the Chief Legal Officer of Aaron Medical. I have been in healthcare my entire career. I've cut across a couple different areas. Device, most recently, I've been in diagnostics. I've been in digital health before digital health was actually a thing. And I remember talking to the FDA about what exactly is digital therapeutics as we were trying to coin the term, and been in biotech. So been a little bit all over the place. I guess I'll go back and so I have a JD MBA. Always knew I wanted to be a lawyer. Always knew I wanted to be in-house. Always thought that lawyers really couldn't speak to the business, and the business didn't really understand what lawyers had to say. So tried to figure out how to bridge the gap, and have spent my career doing a little bit of that. So glad to be here.
Okay, thanks. I'm Alan Carlton. I'm a Division General Counsel for Medical Devices at Fujifilm. I've been with Fujifilm for about 6 years. They have a number of medical device companies, ultrasound, medical imaging, X-ray, and medical informatics. Most of my career was spent in-house at a company started off called US Surgical. A lot of folks in the medical device industry, if you've been in the industry a long time, company may be familiar to you. I spent 20 years with that company, supporting its medical device businesses, and in the last 4, 5, 6 years of it, I guess I was leading the legal department for that surgical device business, a global business. And then I migrated some to a company called Smith & Nephew. A lot of folks in the industry may be familiar with Smith & Nephew. I was chief counsel to their small durable medical equipment subsidiary. And then spent some time in a couple of other device companies, and one adjacency where I was compliance officer for a company that audits healthcare claims for health insurance companies. So a little bit of a diversion there. And that's my history.
Great, thanks both. Well, I'll jump right in here with our first question. We have a couple of questions we prepared, and if anyone has questions that they'd like to ask, feel free to raise your hand. And I know Amanda's also monitoring the chat for questions, Nate. So we'll watch for those. So for both of you, I will toss this question out. Given the increased focus on compliance and risk mitigation in M&A transactions, How do you see the role of legal counsel evolving during the due diligence process? There's a second part to this question, which I'll ask in a moment. So again, just kind of like as things are evolving in terms of new safe harbors, new things to look at from FDA, we got cyber security risks seemingly increasing. How does your role as legal counsel, how has that evolved in the diligence process?
I'll just start off that. On the diligence process, I think that probably traditionally, legal will sort of quarterback the due diligence effort and then actively engage in some of the diligence like corporate governance and things of that sort. And then partner with HR on employment due diligence, with our regulatory and quality in terms of FDA and other regulatory issues, due diligence, and finance and such. I think that with the increasing evolution in terms of enforcement and focus, legal's role as quarterback is really moving to partnering, more active partnering. So certainly I think we still serve as a focal point to organize the diligence effort and pull it all together. But also I think we serve now as a more active partner particularly with our regulatory teams, certainly with our employment teams, to help go through the material and identify where the red flags might be and work with our partners.
I think that's exactly right. And I'll just add, I view this similarly to how I view the legal function across the board for an organization. And one of the things that I often tell my business partners is, please involve me early and involve me often. I think it's with the evolving infrastructure and landscape, I think it's even more important that legal plays a pivotal role in that process. These things move fast and you never want to be the gating factor. So the earlier you're involved, the more you know, the more you can help, the more you can kind of ask the right questions along the way. I've been fortunate enough that I've actually, led a lot of the BD efforts for many of the companies that I've worked for. And I think it's just been super helpful because again, I can learn the business that we're looking to, take over or partner with earlier, and having that understanding of the business allows me to ask the right questions and allows me to bring in the right people earlier in the process so that they can ask the smart people can ask the questions.
That makes great sense. Just to follow up on that question, maybe I'll start with you, Irina. You had mentioned that things are evolving and there's a lot of technical aspects to all of this. How do you all stay on top of this? I'll just ask my question. Are there any specific skills or areas of expertise that attorneys should develop to stay ahead of these challenges? Again, I know personally, just seeing from Paul's presentation, there's a lot of big names in the news when it comes to breaches and whatnot. I'm not sure where I would begin if I were to try and attempt to uncover all of those things before they happen. I guess Paul would know better than I would, but it seems like kind of a daunting task.
I think that going back to my previous comment, I think it really is important to have a little bit of that operational expertise to be able to get into the business and understand what they're doing so that you know what questions to ask and so that you know what you don't know, right? And at that point you bring in the right experts to ask the real questions and understand the subject matter. But I think it's, of course you have a good diligence checklist, of course you have a set of questions to ask, but actually being able to understand, some of those answers and understand what it is that the business that you're acquiring or that you're working with is trying to do allows you to really dig a little deeper, ask more questions, and again, bring in the right experts.
That makes a lot of sense. And Alan, love to hear what you have to say. I was just thinking one thing that you mentioned about that you brought into the business early and often knowing what they're doing. So if maybe they say, we're going to start collecting patient data, we're going to put it in the cloud, it's going to be resident on this device, then you start to think, okay, I've heard about this, that, and the other thing. I have these data points, so I'm going to start to dig in. I remember, if that's a fair assessment, I remember, I don't remember if it was in a movie or something I saw, but they're talking about a general counsel's role. It's in a book I think I read. And they said, some really boring ones. They said the general counsel's job is to look around, be able to look around the corner for trouble before it
outcomes, which is, yeah, obviously impossible unless maybe you have a mirror. But, you know, that kind of goes to your point, like you maybe are starting to anticipate risks before they even occur.
That's exactly right. And that's spot on, right? You understand that they're collecting patient data. Well, maybe you didn't realize that before. So you bring in the privacy people, you bring in IT, you make sure that you're looking at the infrastructure that you otherwise wouldn't have looked at because that wasn't a risk that you initially saw. So really kind of understanding and trying to get as far behind that corner as you can is critical. And it's not always that easy. And sometimes, you know, you ask one question and it kind of spirals and you learn more and then you are on a totally different path that you initially anticipated being on. But being involved in all of those conversations allows you to pivot as you need to, because there's a lot of pivoting that happens in the process.
Thank you. Alan, I think you had some comments.
Yeah, I mean, I would build on that. I think that as we know, questions and gender questions build one on top of the other. And I think that, you know, it would be helpful and important not to silo too much the due diligence process. So for the very reasons that have been mentioned, you know, some of the information may be gathered by the individual disciplines, be it HR, be it information security, be it finance, and they'll look at it from their agenda. But if legal is at the table with them, we can bounce each other's ideas and questions off so we can anticipate where are the potential risks that we're seeing or that might be uncovered in the course of the due diligence. In terms of specific skill areas, I think that obviously we've talked about HIPAA here. I think that certainly, as the earlier presentations also emphasized, you know, HIPAA, if we're dealing with patient data in connection with the target company, is a growing and ballooning area for enforcement, very high stakes, very costly, and constantly evolving. So certainly that's an area that if you don't have it today, it's something that you might want to consider building some expertise, at least an ability to understand the basics and then bring in an expert to assist if you don't have the expertise. A couple of other areas that I think are similarly sort of ballooning or growing in terms of enforcement activity that we might want to consider having or developing some skill sets and at least working understanding is in the area of OFAC and BIS, Bureau of Industry and Security. There's a lot of trade embargoes in the US now, growing sanctions, very costly, for example, on the import side. And so that's something that, you know, you might want to develop some expertise in and skill set in if you don't have it. And obviously the FDCA. And then I would suggest as we look through all the due diligence we've talked about, also see if you can discern patterns, not just red flags, isolated red flags, but if there's small things that are seeming to pop up in a number of places that might uncover as something of a pattern that could create a bigger vulnerability.
Thank you.
Mark?
Yep. Got a question?
I'm not sure.
Sure.
Well, I don't know if it's on. What's the threshold for, or what are the factors that come into your mind or your feelings when you just don't see it in the company? And that means the expertise, whether it be substance or legal, that kind of triggers you to say, maybe we ought to seek help. I mean, you said you were sitting around with people and calling in people from the company. There must be something in your experience that tells you we don't have it here today to solve a problem and probably should seek other expertise.
Well, so, I mean, internally, right, depending on how, I think it's a little bit of a feeling, right? You're asking questions and you're getting answers and you don't know what to do with them. And I think, certainly from my perspective, these are big investments. These are big, risks potentially. And so you want to make sure that you're bringing in the right experts. And if, depending on the size of my organization, if we have somebody that's, a privacy expert, then, I've worked with them in the past and I know what they've set up in terms of infrastructure at our own organization, then I know I can rely on them to evaluate another organization. If, we don't have that, then I will certainly look to bring someone in. Same thing across, whether it be regulatory, whether it be clinical, whether it be, commercial. The I think that question also kind of, the bigger risk I see is if we're having those conversations and if we're trying to ask the questions and the other side doesn't have the answers. I think that's the bigger risk, and that's not necessarily bringing someone in to understand the gaps there. I think that's a big red flag for us as to whether or not we proceed with further conversations. So I think that's, for me, I know my organization well enough to know where we have expertise and where we have gaps, I think, for the most part. But it's really, I think the bigger, to me, challenge and risk is if we're hitting, dead ends and barriers on the other side and not being able to get the questions that we want answered, or not being able to ask the right questions from that side.
Yeah, I think I'd certainly agree with that. I think that if the target is, and if they're a small company, there's a good chance that they will be pretty light in terms of internal expertise in some of these areas. That may be a signal that those are areas that you want to take a much deeper dive on to see how the company is managing those risks, and if there are issues that we need to deal with. One other quick point in terms of the bringing legal in early and on the due diligence in the various areas. Obviously, diligence is to uncover risks, and so they can be evaluated, might affect the price, might even affect the decision to acquire it all. But also, if things go as hoped for, at the end of the process, your company, if you're the acquiring company, will own a new company. If you're seeing red flags, and these are potentially risks that could pose civil liability or even criminal liability, knowing that you might want to assume those risks after the acquisition, having a legal at the table early will enable you and put you in a better position to avoid unprivileged communications occurring amongst your team about those risks before you delve into them. If you're going to own that risk if you decide to go forward after the acquisition, and if your own team has been building non-privileged communications about it, it's just that harder to deal with that risk.
Well, and also, one, you have a roadmap to remediating those risks as you move forward. But the other piece is that, depending on what that risk is, you'll want to make sure that you have that, you may ask the question around whether or not there's sufficient insurance on, the target side to make sure that we can address any sort of risks that happen before the close. And then if there's sufficient insurance on, my side to then address the risks going forward.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I echo that too. And I'd also, in terms of insurance, mentioned for cybersecurity, cybersecurity insurance is very expensive. And I've seen large customers, beginning more and more to press their suppliers to have large coverage on cybersecurity, which is very expensive. And the insurers are looking for a lot of requirements, multi-factor authentication, a variety of things that you may not have at the target. And so even if they have cybersecurity insurance to some extent, or they don't have it at all, one of the things in terms of that insurance risk might be to take a look at them with your risk manager to see, are they positioned so that you'll be able to put them under your cyber policy, or is there going to take time and investment to put them in a position to be able to do that?
Great points, great conversation. And not to make it into an insurance seminar, but there's just a pretty interesting topic. I wonder if there's an opportunity to even purchase a policy that would act as a tail for some sort of, risk you may be facing. Maybe we'll punt on that question for now, but this does kind of bring us into our next question around this DOJ Safe Harbor, another new one where the government's really encouraging self-disclosure. And you find something that's going on. In Amanda's example, you had kickbacks taking place among a region with reps, and you just kind of learned about it during due diligence. I think in that case, Amanda rightfully so mentioned, you really want to do an investigation and figure out what's going on there before you need to go to the DOJ. Obviously, you don't want to go to them just, hey, by the way, we uncovered this. We'll get back to you. But I'll just read the question here. So this new safe harbor seemingly creates a tension between encouraging disclosure and the potential negative consequences of uncovering misconduct. So, how far does someone want to dig? Like the question here is how can companies navigate this balance during due diligence, and what strategies can they employ to protect themselves while still complying with the new policy? So I know like Amanda and I and others on our team will act as compliance officers for clients during times when they just need a contract person. I know that she and I, if we started to uncover some malfeasance, we would be digging really deep because ultimately we feel like we're responsible as our client who's potentially in trouble. But I do see the point here of this tension between encouraging disclosure and also the consequences of uncovering that misconduct. Do you have any comments on how to address that?
Yeah, so in my view, it's to the advantage of both clearly the acquiring company, but even the acquired company to uncover issues before the closing, if there are issues there to be uncovered. I don't think it will benefit, certainly not the acquiring company, because they're going to be purchasing a liability that they're not prepared for if they have intentionally chosen not to dig too deep because they might find some bad stuff here. But even for the acquired company, there's going to be post-closing risks and liabilities if they know that there's some lurking landmine there and they're trying to divert attention from the acquiring company. That was likely to surface after the acquisition, and now there's questions of fraudulent representations, breach of representations, indemnities, all kinds of difficulties for both the acquired company and the acquiring company.
On that note, definitely make sure that you have good covenants in place and good indemnity language in the merger agreement. But I absolutely agree. I think there's certainly benefit to the acquirer to ensure that they've done sufficient work on the on the front end, but that's not always possible, right? And so there are, of course, as you start integrating the business, you learn things and uncover things that may have seemed insignificant or may not have, really kind of come up in the process. And I think to the conversation you had earlier, and unfortunately I missed it. It's a matter of making sure that you're really investigating and understanding exactly what it is that you've just uncovered and walked into. But it's at a certain point, if they didn't disclose that as part of the diligence process, you also don't know what conversations they've had with others, with externally with regulators. You don't know how much scrutiny they've been under necessarily, right? And so at some point you may want to start having those conversations because it may have already started, right? The scrutiny may already exist, and you don't want to be perceived as though you're hiding something or not really disclosing something. So as long as you've really understood the risk, gone through the exercise of investigating it, making sure that you have a pathway forward, right? Make sure you have some road map to remediating it. I think you do start having those conversations because again, they may have already started long before you, and you just, that was as hidden as everything else was in the process.
Yeah, thanks. Great comments. I know as having been a part of deals where we've uncovered things, sometimes it's like, okay, that's a deal breaker, we're done. Other times we'll just stop doing it. And I think the new, wrinkle on this is now this policy, right? Come to us and we will avoid prosecuting you. I don't know how popular that will be. I know, what were the poll numbers? Half the people I think said they would disclose. I don't know if half of those people are all responsible for making that decision. So, but I'm kind of just curious if you two would like to share any thoughts. I'll reserve my thoughts until maybe after you two give yours. So,
yeah, so the question of disclosure or not disclosure, I mean, there's a lot, and the safe harbor is certainly inviting in terms of, especially for an acquirer, in the terms of trying to mitigate or even eliminate the liability risk vis-a-vis the criminal law. But the safe harbor is not going to protect you from liability in terms of civil liability. It's not going to protect against state crimes either. And so, and by making a voluntary disclosure under the safe harbor, you're also potentially making an admission, thereby really setting yourself up in terms of a liability lawsuit if there's a key TAM relator out there, or the government just thank you for the, the information. Now we won't go after you on the criminal. Let's turn this over to OIG and we work with them and the DOJ to now pursue the civil liability, particularly, for example, on the anti-kickback side, but also other areas as well. So I think that's a tension that's not got to be considered. If there is an issue there, I mean, and the decision is maybe let's make a disclosure. There are obviously self-disclosure policies in other parts of the government as well. And it may be that you want to look at this strategically to try to have a global disclosure and a global settlement, so you get it out of, try to get it out of the way, both in terms of criminal and law and civil, if that's practical and feasible. The other aspects to that are, again, you're going to potentially assume the risk. So one of the things you may want to do is you're beginning to uncover this kind of a potentially criminal situation, is to consider whether or not, I think, to have a joint defense or common interest agreement with the target. So if that's feasible, to put it under privilege and have a more frank discussion with the target, with the acquisition, the company to be acquired. So those are some of the thoughts that I had on that.
So I completely agree with all of that. The one, the other side of it is a little bit to what end, right? Depending on what it is, right? If it's a false claims thing, or it could be something that is hugely influential in your decision to acquire the company as it is, right? It could be the full revenue driver of the company. And so depending on what stage you are in the process, the joinder thing may not work, right? Because you may have to, because that may be an issue that now you're at odds with the target. But I think it's important to understand exactly, again, what it is and, how you can, depending on what stage, right? Can you walk away? Or if the deal has closed and you're learning something now, and it would have drastically changed your decision to move forward with the acquisition to begin with, I think that those are different considerations, and you're going to need to figure out a path forward that you may want to disclose, but you want to understand what that path looks like and understand your timeline to achieving, to remediating that before you include other parties.
Yeah, it's quite a dance with the government, right? There's a lot of trust on both sides of that equation. I know having this some years back, but Vermont had an amnesty program around their gift ban law, and I had a client decide to kind of go along with that and tell them, well, we did these things, only to be then fined. So it was kind of a strange amnesty program. But, so there's that, right? You could go to the government and then, Amanda laid out the elements that they'll consider when deciding whether or not to prosecute, but obviously there's no guarantees that they won't. And Alan, you intelligently talked about all the other fallout that could occur. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see where that all winds up. And I'm sure Amanda will keep us abreast on if we hear of anyone taking advantage of it in the news.
Yeah, Mark, one other quick point to bear in mind with the safe harbor is that if it's already known to the government, you're not going to get advantage. If it's an AKS issue, there's a real risk, I imagine, that there's a whistleblower out there. And if there is, the complaint's going to be under seal, most likely. So you're not going to have any way to know that the government already knows about it. So that's, I think, a big challenge in terms of making a decision to go or no go on the disclosure.
Yeah.
To the point I made earlier also, right? Whistleblower or not, there may be, the acquirer may actually know that something is happening, and if they fail to disclose the initial issue, they may have also just failed to disclose that. And so you don't quite know what the government already knows and what conversations have been had. So you want to be really careful. To your point, it's a dance.
Yeah, I'd say, suffice it to say, the best thing you can do is if you've uncovered it, if you've moved forward with your transaction, shut that down and clean it up as fast as you can and document that so you can.
One more
David,
question
comment?
about that. What if you have, or how do you factor in not quite cleaned up? In other words, no releases. So people were told you're done. Some 4 out of 5 people involved signed a release or whatever document you think helps, but somebody didn't. So they can go to, they can become a whistleblower. Of course, they all can become a whistleblower probably, having done that, but I just curious about that, how you view that lack of cleanup
You
in the
try to get a
transaction.
release.
Yeah, well, okay. Right. Just said, if it's been like 18 months, do you really want to go back there? But if it stands in the way of the transaction, then you do exactly that. It's just,
I mean, and one of the diligence questions is always making sure that you have every, former employee, do you have every release and,
right.
has everyone signed a release? Has everyone signed a, IP just, relinquishing all of their IP rights.
Right, yeah.
And that's part of every diligence process, but certainly if there's one, you try to chase it down maybe, or you go at risk.
Okay, all right.
Thank you, Irina. We're sharing this microphone here. I appreciate you having you back and forth. I think we probably have time for one, maybe two more questions here. This one relates more to cybersecurity because for me, this is kind of a fascinating subject. Paul leads our privacy and cyber practice at the firm, but I was again impressed by the number of headlines about medical device companies, otherwise, other healthcare companies, and it's an issue that's on the rise, right? Like in terms of litigation, fines, and whatnot. And now, not to put you on the spot, Paul, but how many state laws do we have that are now, since California's law is so restrictive that the federal government, the federal Congress can't pass a law that's as strict as California is, right? Maybe I'll just let you comment for a moment, and then I will ask this question.
Yeah, in terms of privacy law, we're around 21 states, 20 with comprehensive laws, and then a couple that have overlapped into, excuse me, healthcare consumer privacy too.
Okay, and it's fair to say that California's law is so strict that Congress doesn't want to pass a law that strict, and so we don't have federal legislation, so we don't have 21 laws, and we're on our way to 50 different.
That's a way to characterize it for sure. There's a lot of nuance there. Yeah.
So I don't know, as GCs within companies mining this, that just seems like a challenge. So the question here is, cybersecurity risks and regulatory compliance issues often include complex technical aspects. Everything's getting more technical. We went to law school to learn the law, not all these technical aspects, right? How can attorneys effectively bridge the gap between legal and technical understanding during due diligence? And what resources or collaborations are essential for ensuring a thorough assessment of these risks?
Sure, I can start. So I think one thing that's very important is making sure that you have a good partner on the IT security, privacy side, wherever, however that's split within an organization, and making sure that they are involved in that conversation, the process earlier, to the extent that the target company has any sort of, data considerations, if anything of that sort. I also think it's important, kind of going back to the point I made earlier, to understand what's happened. One of the gating questions is, what does the other company have? What infrastructure do they have? What policies do they have? What processes do they have? Because if that's really a mess, that is something that you should definitely, that should be a red flag. And that's something that's going to require, I think, far more diligence and far more getting into the weeds of exactly how they are working with data, how they are protecting it, how they have, what releases they have, what policies they have. So I think it's a very important area, and one that you should at least start to address pretty early in the diligence process, because I think that's one of the few areas that I think could be an absolute deal breaker if it's if there's not a way to, if you're not seeing any type of results that you want to see as part of that diligence effort. I also think that again, seeing where they are, if they have any sort of cyber policy in place, I think that would be helpful for any pre-close issues that come up later on. And I think the other part that's important is, understanding what kind of covenants you can put in place into your agreement to address any risks that may come up later in the process.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with all that. I would also add that, well, a couple of things. First of all, even before an acquisition or just in the normal course of the day-to-day, hopefully legal is partnering pretty closely with our information security team as issues come up, be it a security incident where maybe some data was lost, not because of a bad actor, but just because something went wrong internally. Legal has to partner with information security in those sorts of instances to determine whether or not if it's patient data that may have been not compromised, but lost, perhaps if it's strictly and only a security incident. You don't have a reporting obligation to the government, but you may pretend, and likely would, to your customers. And you also have to help work with the information security team to assess that is, in that example, strictly and only a security incident and not potentially a breach as well. But then looking at the target, so if you've got this good working relationship, that helps. Then partnering with your information security expert as he or she evaluates the state of security at the target. As issues come up, the legal expertise will be helpful, both clearly in terms of 21 state laws, if you've got that command, or you may reach out to Gardner for help. HIPAA, also contracts. So if the target has contracts with their customers, and if they're post-market, if they're out there with a product, then a lot of those, certainly if there's business associate agreements, but even without that, a lot of these customer agreements are going to have cybersecurity requirements. And it might be important to take a look with your information security team to see if they're meeting their obligations to their customers. It probably won't come to the fore until there's a breach of data, but that makes the liability that much greater if they have been found to also have fallen down on their contractual obligations. So in effect, I think that the information security team have the expertise. They know about firewalls and audit controls and pings and all kinds of things that we are not going to, well, most of us, or me, are not going to know that level of expertise on the technical side, but we hopefully can partner with them, have a working understanding of those technical aspects so we understand the language, but then also partner with them for the legal infrastructure behind that.
The one thing I'll add that's spot on is you also do want to evaluate where the data is of the target company, because a lot of your contractual obligations perhaps may limit the data to being in the US, and they may be working with subcontractors who knows where. And so it is important to know where that data resides and what they're doing with it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And indeed, that especially a smaller company may not be paying attention to that. So there you have contractual issues right there too, because a lot of customers will insist in their contract that the data be held on in country, in the US. So I agree. That's and there was one other point, but it's escaped me now.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, we really didn't get into the OUS, i.e. international privacy law space, but obviously seen some of the headlines out of Europe with GDPR, and the fines are just astronomical. But and save that for another time. Do we have any questions online we need to address? Okay. And I think we're probably pretty close to time here, but with the few minutes we have left, anything on Loper, AKA Chevron doctrine, is that kind of a ho-hum for y'all, or is that something boards need to be, if you're a GC online here in the audience, is that something that you all are really worried about? Or is it more like David said, it's an opportunity that we don't really know about yet? Maybe there's something related to our product or our space where we can potentially challenge something, and no one's uncovered that. It's almost like just unknown opportunities. I don't know. Any comments there?
I think it's the latter. I think we just don't know yet. I think there's, I think as with anything, it's important to notify, to give,
Uh-oh. I guess that's it.
We're back. Um, I think it's important to provide periodic updates to the board and just kind of notify them of the landscape of the change, any changes to the landscape and, what's happening and, kind of provide watch outs. But I don't know that there's much more to be done at this point, or at least that's how I feel.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that the departure from many years of precedent in that regard has just injected a tremendous amount of uncertainty amongst all businesses and all individuals, and it's it creates angst in terms of how much can I rely on the current regulatory scheme. But that's all you've got, right? So you've got to continue to rely on it, but it gives the in-house attorneys and our reliance on our partners like Gardner, to be out there keeping an eye out for where are the regulations going to be being attacked based on LOPR, so we can again try to stay ahead of the curve.
Thanks. And I will comment for David if he allows me to. We teach law back in Minnesota at a couple law schools, and we've read a lot of FDA cases and otherwise, and I'm just not sure the judges are really going to want to dig into a lot of these incredibly technical scientific topics. So I'm not sure how much will change, but who knows? I think that's the end of our program. Thank you very much to our panelists here, and thanks for attending today.
Really great, guys. Thanks for the invitation. Awesome. It's fun. Oh, she gave me a little bag. I don't think you got your bag.
I didn't get a bag.
Tracy?